Hi, this is Gerard Daché. I'm the Executive Director of the Government Blockchain Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural event of Government Blockchain Live or live stream. Today, I'm going to, hang on a second, I got to do this, mute this. Cool. Um, what this live stream is going to be all about is we're going to get together on a weekly basis. We're going to talk to different GBA members in the public and private sector. We're going to talk about the topics and issues of the day and where this thing is going. And it's really intended just to be kind of a conversation. Of course, since it's being live streamed, we'll get comments and respond to those comments. Today, I've got a fairly brand new GBA member, Kristen Kamir, is with us. Chris, it's great to have you here. Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about who you are and what brought you to this space and why you joined the GBA?
Yeah, so I'm one of the two general managers here at Satsini Capital. We are a blockchain venture fund, or probably more Web3 venture fund. Blockchain is a subset of Web3. And the way we came to this topic is I'm originally an engineer, a field engineer, and then also a field lawyer. So I feel at everything that I start essentially. But when I failed from the law, I happened to be general counsel for one of the early internet service providers in Europe. And it's now part of what's the largest internet service provider in Europe. So I retired from the law after we merged it 20 years ago, and we moved to Southern California to set up our first venture fund, which was focused on voice over IP solution, multi-massive online player games. So it has a lot to do with the topic that we focus on today, which is the Web3 space. And I actually don't internally call it Web3. I refer to it as building the World Wide Web for the first time. The reason is I was running a startup for some time from like 2004 to 2008. There was Yelp before Yelp, which we sold in 2008. And afterwards started to write a thesis paper on the decentralization of the web. And we kind of came to the conclusion at the time that we never developed the World Wide Web. What I mean by that is, and there's a lot more evidence and a lot more awareness for that today, is that what we call the World Wide Web today is really the commercial web. Every part of the sites that you visit is usually controlled and organized by some form of corporation, including all the ways that lead to these platforms. Like, so we have decentralized access to the web in terms of the internet service providers. We have decentralized information distribution in terms of Google and other content aggregators. And so you never actually see the World Wide Web. You're always in some corporate platform environment. And so our thesis is largely developed based on the decentralization of the web, and blockchain is a very important, albeit a very defined part of that.
So you wrote this thesis, and how'd you come to find out about GBA? And I want to come back to you about the thesis.
Sure.
But how'd you find out about GBA?
So the core focus of decentralization is around the topic that people call identity. And I say people call identity because this is really about returning agency to users around the world. So right now the network treats you kind of like an Oracle function that it gets to observe, store, and share the data. And so what we're trying to do is, with different standards organization, including the Government Blockchain Association, to create A, awareness around that, and then B, create a taxonomy to fix it, and then C, create the actual tools to distribute the tools to reverse this paradigm. So specifically, right now, you are more or less the product that's being sold whenever you engage with network topology, and that's really bothersome. So in order for us to change that, we need to work with all agencies and with all technology providers to develop an understanding and the technologies to embrace the fact that we as humans should be the actual agents in the system, as in we should be able to set the agenda if and when and where we interact with these technologies. And so I can break this down in very granular detail, but maybe I'll hand it back to you first.
Sure. So I agree with you, right? That we really don't interact with the web. We really interact with Google or Amazon or some company. but how do you break from that? Like uh, what's what does that look like? Uh, how does decentralization work in something like
Yeah, so maybe I'll share my screen here, which let me see, screen left, monitor left, and I need to drag you out of that. So if you can see that, it shows you what we have right now in terms of infrastructure on the bottom, right? So this is the Web1 stack, which includes TCP/IP, HTTP, SMTP, voice over IP, which we're using right now, and other protocols. And then on top of that, what we're developing right now is decentralized networks, Ethereum, Provenance, and so forth. So these are decentralized networks, but the point there being is they are specifically, what's important to understand, that blockchains are kind of the opposite of databases. The web right now is dominated by database architecture. And the problem with database architecture is that you actually need to have an operator and custodian for this database. So it's not like everybody gets to have equal access to that, but you have one or more companies that are maintaining that, and within those companies, you got one or more administrators. So what this means is that these entities have information and or even assets under their control that rightfully belong to you, but because of the limitations of that database technology, you don't actually get to control it and you have to use someone else. So that holds true for your bank account, right? Your bank account is essentially a database, a ledger, where the bank maintains entries of your values denominated in fiat currencies. And it holds true for the data that pertains to your personal identifiable data, which is maintained now by 4,000 to 5,000 entities, and you have no control over that. So the larger point here being is the purpose of blockchains is mostly to replace these database solutions. And they are specifically the exchange of data. So the current data exchange is such that we don't really exchange the data, it's more a metaphor, but I send you a copy of the data that I have. So right. By virtue of me having access to that, I don't hand over access to you, I just give you another copy, and now we got copies of copies of copies of copies, right? And so the blockchain is really, or a blockchain is really a tool to move one byte from place A to place B. And by the virtue of moving it, I give complete control over to the other entity. But in order for this to then actually be decentralized, we need to have all the facilities that are now centralized. So naming, right? If you register a domain, you don't own it, right? So you get a limited license. If you forget to renew it, it goes back into the pool. Someone else can register it, and there's a for-profit corporation behind it that monetizes that. So that's the next layer. And then we need to interact with blockchains and be able to index data. If you see the graph, for example, that's an index of blockchain data. So it's another layer. So let's call this is half of Google. And then we need new types of browsers. And a lot of times you can think about wallets when people use that term, more of browsers of blockchain, because there are no coins or tokens in your wallets, right? You're actually browsing the blockchain, you're browsing an entry that you have control over usually. And then on top of that, we are now building all these decentralized applications. So whatever is centralized right now, eventually you will have a decentralized version of that. You will have a decentralized Uber, and we always see that. You will have a decentralized Airbnb. Whatever you look at your right now on your phone is a centralized app maintained by a company. You can reasonably expect over time for that to be a decentralized app that's actually censorship resistant, and more importantly, where you can align the interest of the user with those of the entities that are maintaining this particular application.
You know what's fascinating? I've often thought that where we are right now is at this nexus between people that want to see a decentralized future, right? That don't want to be controlled, right? Because every time I jump on the computer and I hit a keystroke, Google knows every keystroke, or there's satellites monitoring me, right? There's cameras everywhere I go.
Right.
So people want to be free from all that. At the same time, you've got very large, powerful institutions that want to maintain the status quo and even double down more on monitoring.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, and that's
talk to me a little bit about the conflict between those two, and whatever your thoughts are about that conflict. And who's going to win?
Well, there's a law in evolution. It's called the law of requisite variety. And it essentially determines that the most flexible within a given system will eventually rule the system. So, and you can see this if you look at technologies, right? So what we're using right now is mostly open source technology. So the voice of IP protocol, anybody can do whatever they want with it. It's free to use. You can fork it, change it, add it, implement it into your solution. Same is true with TCP/IP. Same is true with SMTP. And even the operating system that our servers are using, that we're interacting with right now, use open source technologies, right? So typically some form of Linux, and then some form of a web browser that's open source that you can use, in some form of storage mechanism database right now that's also open source. So a larger point here being is, since these are open source and since volunteers commit their times to that, they're changing much, much faster than companies ever could, and they're changing and adapting much, much faster than government agencies specifically ever could. So it doesn't really matter if people use kind of useless terms such as regulated blockchain, regulated cryptocurrency. Those are non sequiturs, right? So the point here being is that regulation addresses the behavior of people and entities within a certain jurisdiction. So blockchains by default are global, right? So, and they are regulated, but they are regulated by code. So they don't care, obviously, and developers around the world don't care about any individual regulator. So it will always just limit the behavior of citizens and entities within a given jurisdiction. So that's why it's really bothersome that even technologists sometimes kind of repeat this false narrative that there's going to be blockchain regulation, cryptocurrency regulation. Really what it's saying is, if you're regulating is, me, regulator, I want to limit the behavior of adults within my jurisdiction. That's what you're really saying, right? Because you're not doing anything to the technology at all. That is not possible.
You know, I follow a lot of things that regulators are talking about right now, and almost all of their regulation is focused on regulating centralized financial institutions that are already regulated, right? And as we move into more and more DeFi, right, decentralized finance, it seems like many folks in governments don't necessarily have any clue as how they're going to function in a decentralized world, right? When you've got, and especially when you got currencies like Monero and Zcash, privacy coins. I mean, in most part, I think they're not even talking about that because they can't get their head around what that even means. There's a whole new paradigm there. What do you have any thoughts about how regulators should view the world, and where more and more economic activity is moving into a decentralized world?
Right. So indeed, using the exact right term, economic activity, because so the way I personally look at this, so people use that term DeFi usually as a shortcut for decentralized finance. That's not how I use it. I use it as the definancialization of real world economic activity. So if you look at the big picture, look at US GDP, you see a certain percentage, I think it's like 13.5%, that we show as productive activity in GDP that's being assigned to financial services. I disagree with that. I think it's a penalty on actual production, because I assume that you didn't think the last time you paid a convenience fee for moving digits around that were US dollar denominated, you thought of this as being productive. So a simple metaphor here, that's essentially the equivalent of still putting stamps on your email, when that's obviously not necessary from a technology perspective. It's actually not necessary from a technology perspective to have banks in the middle. We can replace almost everything that these entities fulfill today in code, more efficient, 24/7, with physical instant settlement. So for regulators, it's important to realize that makes us stronger as an economy. And also it's important to recognize you do not uninvent these technologies. These technologies will move forward. These technologies will roll out. These technologies will always develop faster than any regulation could ever respond to. And then lastly, what's also important to understand is we are kind of at this intersection. We got all these wild experiments. In my personal opinion, it's important to understand that anything that you call a token right now, you call it coin right now, at the end of the day, is just software. So, but what kind of software is it? It's a token is typically a standardized smart contract, and then the fallacy here is to actually invent a new unit of account, such as Ether or Monero or anything, because as a user, as a regular user, if you're not part of this ecosystem right now, which there's very few people engaging with these things today, it's less than 2% that even have wallets and of people that are on the internet could engage with that. So if and when this should scale, you need to adapt the technology to the user. At the moment, we got a lot of technologists that think that users need to adopt that technology. It's obviously the other way around, right? So people didn't adopt voice over IP, they adopted Skype. They don't care if they're using voice over IP. So larger point here being is most of these cryptocurrencies over time would be just abstracted away if we even need them at all, right? Because you don't really care if your US dollar is expressed in a byte that which underlies a different type of currency. You just care about the translation. And the last point that I'm going to make to that extend is it's important to understand that in the current paradigm, digital money is never at rest. What I mean by that is, so if you look at your demand deposit account, you call it your checking account, then this money is actually always in a state of lending. The difference is that you, as the regular user, having a quote unquote bank account, you don't get to lend it out. So we already have all technologies right now that everybody can act as their own bank, which also means that M1, so this kind of spending money in digital form, doesn't have to exist at all, because what I expect to happen is that any wallet that you will ever use in the future will move whatever you call your fiat deposits into a state of lending that yields you something. And by the way, you can observe this right now. We have custodial exchanges that pay 7 or 8% APR on a stablecoin, on a US dollar peg. Obviously, your checking account doesn't do this, and even your money market accounts and your certificates of deposits don't do this. So centralized lending, centralized banking cannot compete with that, right?
That's crazy, right? So, so think about from a government regulator's perspective, right? If as people get to learn and know more about cryptocurrency, and they know that they can stake their money as opposed to putting it in a bank, right? That they get much higher interest. Um, just the performance. If you look at Bitcoin compared to the U.S. dollar, Bitcoin has performed better than the U.S. dollar every year since it's existed, right? Year over year. I think even today, it's early, or it's mid to late July 2021. A year ago, Bitcoin was around 60,000. Today, it's around 32,000. Right? It still is performing better than the U.S. dollar, because literally every year the U.S. dollar erodes in value. Right? It goes backwards.
It's very important to understand nuances there, because typically, I mean, you're touching on the topic of inflation, right? Inflation is actually way more nuanced than people usually talk about. So inflation mostly happens to the asset class that new money is being created for, right? So right now, most money is being created by commercial banks, which is already somewhat questionable if you consider the fact that money is probably a public good from the perspective of a citizen. But commercial banks get to create new money by the way of lending, right? So when you get a house loan, and let's say it's $500,000, then the money that they're giving you, that's new money. And what it does initially, it's actually inflating the asset class. So housing in the United States has been inflated by 50%, 50%. over the past 20 years. So it's consistently pricing out people out of that group. It's anywhere between 0.5% and 1% a year. Less people can afford housing. So it's the inflation of that particular asset class. The other asset class that has been inflating also due to government intervention is the topic of education. It has been inflating tremendously over the past decades or two. And so then lastly, obviously, this new money also then inflates broad money supply. But that's actually the least worrisome aspect. But you mentioned the topic of Bitcoin, right? So it's important to understand that the Bitcoin at its current state is a commodity, right? So it's very rare that people are actually using it for payments, right? That's maybe the case in some small country like El Salvador and in some edge cases, but by and large, people use fiat money to make payments, and that's its secondary function. So its secondary use case, actually, the primary function of money is simply that of unit of account. And so that's why for some time, I've been trying to get people to understand this by this very simple metaphor. So if you have three people that look at a house, and the first person looks at the house and thinks, oh, I probably would pay $1 million for this house. And the second person is looking at the same house and he's thinking, oh, I'll probably pay about 900,000 euros for the house. And the third person looks at the same house and thinks, oh, I think it's probably worth 12 million pesos. Well, it's the same house, right? So as long as you're just thinking about the value of real world economic activity, then fiat is just your language of value. It's just language. Yeah. So now let me just finish the metaphor because it's useful for a lot of people to understand. So now you encounter the seller. And let's say we happen to be in Tajikistan. It's a real country with its own currency and called the Somoni, I believe. And so now the seller wants Somonis. He has made up his mind. He wants a certain number of Somonis. So you now have to come to two agreements. A, we have to agree what language of value do we want to speak? Do we want to speak US dollar? Do we want to speak euros? Do you want to speak pesos? Do you want to speak Somonis? Once that agreement has been reached, you agree about, okay, how do we want to exchange this? So now you're talking about your medium of exchange. Will you accept a check? Will you accept cash? Will you accept diamonds? Will you accept fiat currency by the way of wire? And the last one is the default, as in the default medium of exchange has been bytes, right? Has been bytes for decades. It doesn't matter if you're swiping your credit card or you're using your debit card or you're using PayPal or something else, the medium of exchange is the same as in Bitcoin, it's bytes. And the unit of account is also the same, right? The unit of account for Bitcoin is the US dollar. If you look at your wallet, it will translate it for you into the US dollar, or if you're in Europe, it will translate it to you in euros.
So, I've been thinking a lot about this, the definition of money, right? And up until fairly recently, when we talked about money, we said, okay, well, money is something that has these several properties, right? Unit of account, store of value, means for deferred payment. One of them, which optionally is in or out, depending on the definition, is a means of control, right? And what I've been thinking about lately is we used to have this thing called a dollar or a peso, and it had to meet all of that criteria for it to be quote unquote money. But now, I might use Bitcoin for a store of value, but I wouldn't use it to buy my Starbucks coffee because I don't need 51% of every computer in the universe to validate that Starbucks transaction.
Yeah. So
I might use. Well, let me just finish this thing. I might use Litecoin potentially or some other, lower friction thing to buy them. But I might use Bitcoin to buy a house or a car, right? Because it's just the way the fees work. And I might use something else in a smart contract for a means of deferred payment. And what I'm coming to realize is we don't need a single thing to have all those properties. We can have different things that have those properties better than others. And when I go to make a transaction, my phone can go through, these are the different types, and we can use AI or different technologies to use the right mechanism or vehicle for that. And so our whole concept of what money is and how it works I think is going to change. And with it, our whole concept of economic models are going to have to change.
Well,
Because
the truth is it has changed and we have hold on to the old definitions. So if you look at this usual definition that people still learn today, which was wrong at the time it was written in 1875 by a guy called Jevons. So he created this misguided definition of money as a store of value, unit of account, and medium of exchange. What this actually describes is only commodity money. And commodity money at no time was actually a large scale system to manipulate economic activity at scale. It was always ledger technology. So in history, we started out just remembering, so using wetware, what we owed each other. And then we started to supplement this with like calves in sticks. And then eventually the first clay tables that were found, those were ledgers. That's the earliest form of writing. And then we invented paper and started recording ledgers in this way. And then in the 60s, we invented databases. So that's the actual history of money. The actual history of money is ledgers. And a very tiny subset is commodity money. So something that you hand over and you achieve instant settlement. But that was always a niche case and still is today, right? It was never practical. Even just 200 years ago, when most people worked in farming here in the United States, gold was entirely unuseful for them as a daily medium of exchange, and they probably couldn't afford it. So that's an entire myth. It's a myth that we ever were gold-based or any other commodity money had any relevance for real-world economic activity at scale. And so is the myth of barter. So the technology for value exchange has always been ledger on an economic level, right? And so blockchains are just a much better ledger, right? Because it allows you to create digital bearer instruments. It allows you to create instant settlement electronically. And that was not actually possible, right? Before the creation and a rollout of the Bitcoin network, that wasn't possible.
I want to talk for a second. We talked a little bit about kind of where we've come from and some of the paradigms. I want to talk about where we're going, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's just a fascinating subject, right? So I saw one statistic that said in the United States, there's about close to 10% of the population are cryptocurrency users right now or have wallets. I heard or read another one that said 40% of college kids have cryptocurrency. Clearly, the younger is going to have more than the older generations. But but if you look at sort of the state of things in terms of who's accepting cryptocurrency, when the regulators continue to focus on the current financial institutions, you got more and more people learning about hardware wallets and browser-based wallets and AML, KYC and wallets, and where do you think we're going, and how fast do you think we're going?
Oh, that's what I was referring to earlier. You can already see exactly where we're going. So if you're using one of the, I don't want to name any particular one, but if you're using any of the custodial exchanges, you can just leave your M1 in there and it's pegged to the US dollar and it's earning you interest. So, and you can also use the same wallet then to spend. And you can also use the same wallet to do a peer-to-peer transfer of someone who also has a wallet. So at that point in time, there's actually no need to even go into fiat at all. More importantly, though, there's no need to go into the state of M1, as in the money that doesn't earn you interest and the money that's deflating in purchasing power. But the larger topic here is, and that's what we are focusing on for the time being, is that we actually use the existing money that's within the system. So for what I mean by that is, a couple of months ago, for the first time since forever, the money supply in M2 exceeded that of aggregate mortgages. So what does that mean? So that means that we actually—
And can you for a lot of people that are listening, can you define M1, M2? Just
sure. So yeah. So and actually, we can't. The Federal Reserve kind of dropped it and stopped using and tracking it because it's just impossible. It's fell off a cliff. So M1, the typical definition of that is It's your demand deposit account. That's most of it. So your checking account, and then also physical cash, right? And obviously physical cash you have in your pocket, you can spend right away. And it's important to understand that most of physical cash that's US dollar denominated is actually outside of the United States. It's not within the United States, and actually our most profitable export product. But then secondly, you got M2, which the way it works, it includes M1. But for my particular purposes, I would subtract it from that. As in M2 is mostly money market accounts and certificate of deposit. So money that earns you interest, to simplify this. So the point here being is that this latest group after the stimulus started to exceed the group the aggregate mortgage account. So what we can do and what we're seeing happening, and we made an investment in a company that's already unicorn in that space, is we can bridge those two groups. As in, you have M2, well, you can directly, quote unquote, lend it to people who have mortgages, and both of you, your M2 return's going to be higher, and B, the money that you pay for your mortgage, the interest you pay on your mortgage is going to be lower. And that's mainly because you're removing the middleman and the commercial bank out of the equation.
So um, from a government perspective, one of the luxuries of being part of the United States government is you can pretty much spend whatever you want to, because it's a bottomless pit. As long as you got checks in the checkbook, you can just keep writing checks. What's the impact, do you think?
Well, comes back to technology, right? So what are the downsides? So the downside is that anything that I hold on to denominated in US dollar cash, unless I lend it out, it's going to lose purchasing power, right? That's the main complaint that people have. And so that is technically already solved, but it comes back to that the future is not evenly distributed yet, but eventually my expectation is that no one will use a wallet that doesn't have that particular feature, and no one will use bank accounts if they're in their right mind and let money deflate in its purchasing power.
As do you think people will then move away from using US dollars? And
no, they don't have to. That's my point. So because it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if you're using Bitcoin or Litecoin or Ether or anything else. The unit of account is always the same. The unit of account, if you look at your digital wallet, is the US dollar. So we already see lots and lots of wallets that will just act as your personal financial advisor and just get rid of the stuff that's most inflationary. And for the time being, there will always be some fiat currency. And needless to say, fiat currency competes on an international level, albeit in the past it only competed on international level at scale. So the FX markets, which are some of the largest markets in the world. But now I can take it down to the consumer level, right? So if I can swap my pesos to US dollars, and my US dollars has less inflation than my pesos, well, then I want to hold it in that. And if I move to the next step and I'd rather hold a portion of that in Bitcoin or some other commodity that I expect to increase in value, I'll move some of this in that. But the point being is that wallets will make it super easy and already do to some extent. It's unfortunate actually that a lot of teams just focus too much on creating new units of accounts when that's utterly unnecessary, right?
Let me clarify or ask the question differently. So if I just take dollars in Bitcoin, right, and dollars has an ever expanding supply,
yes,
and Bitcoin has a limited supply, right?
Yes.
Then as a unit of account, doesn't the dollar become less valuable over time?
No, the remaining function of fiat for a long time obviously has been simply that of language of value. So you have to differentiate between what is the function and what are the use cases. So the function of fiat is that of language. The use cases are spending and lending, with the later one being the more important one, right? So you want to borrow money in fiat, which is great. You don't care if that inflates, right? And you pay it back with something else, and you convert whatever commodity you want to hold, can be Bitcoin, can be gold, can be some other commodity. You convert it if and when and where someone on the other hand actually still is asking for that. And then will become over time will become less and less and less. But it's practically impossible. The US dollar would have to hyperinflate for Bitcoin to become a unit of account, right?
So I'm not so concerned about the unit of account. What I'm really concerned is the economic value or number associated with it, right? Because if in last year, from March 2020 to March 2021, we went from 4 trillion to 18 trillion dollars in supply of money, right? Which essentially is in part causing inflation, right? And so Michael Saylor made the decision that rather than keeping his money in, I don't know, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in U.S. dollars, he's moving it over to Bitcoin because I guess he believes, right, in the most recent prices would say that he was wrong, but I think he was long term that the value will increase in Bitcoin, right, as compared to the U.S. dollar, just based on large scale economic trends.
Sure.
And so whether the language is dollars, right, but in terms of which of those currencies I'm going to hold to protect my assets, to protect my economic activity, right?
So you wouldn't want to hold any currency. So that's also why it's wrong at this particular point in time to think about Bitcoin as a currency. So what people do is they buy the Bitcoin mining reward. Lowercase b Bitcoin is Bitcoin's mining reward. Bitcoin doesn't have a minting function. There is no currency. We keep calling it a cryptocurrency, but it's only a currency in terms of its network function. But you can move whatever you want on top of that. But what people actually do is they speculate on the mining reward. The mining reward is a commodity.
And this goes back to what I said earlier about currency, I think, having multiple functions, and we can kind of break it up in that we don't need one thing that handles all things. My opinion is that as more and more people become comfortable with using alternatives to the dollar, different types of tokens, and economic activities is not dependent on the acquisition of dollars. It might be denominated in dollars, right?
No,
but if I no longer need to essentially actually possess US dollars in order to buy, $5 worth of Starbucks.
Yeah, and you never do, by the way, right? So that's another nuance that makes actually a difference. What I mean by that is, so even the physical cash that you say you own, you don't own. What I mean by that is, so you get a license, you get a usage right? So if you pay close attention, there's actually a law that if you deface it and make it unuseful for its intended purpose, which is exchange, you can go to prison for up to 6 months for every infraction. Because these Federal Reserve notes at any point in time are owned by the issuer, which is the US Treasury. So you don't own that. Also, you cannot actually own any digital dollars right now. The bank owns it. So if people say they're depositing something, that is actually legally incorrect. You're actually giving the bank an interest-free loan. All digital money, fiat denominated, is in a constant state of lending. So that's why there's also very little use, obviously, of savings accounts and so forth. But that's why I said it's very, very important to distinguish what is the function of money, which is just language, and what are the use cases. The use cases are spending and lending. That's it. And so outside of that, how you want to invest, obviously, is always a matter of your portfolio allocation. I wouldn't recommend that you put 100% of your net worth in Bitcoin. That's a rather volatile proposition right now, right? So you typically have a basket of things, and that basket, as I said, you shouldn't have 100% of Bitcoin, should have some Bitcoin in there, right? Should have, and even Paul Tudor Jones now makes that case, and I think his suggestion was like 5 to 10%. I'm actually a little more careful than that. I would say it should not be more than 5%, but it shouldn't be less than 1%, because there's always the not insignificant chance that there's going to be a technical bug of sorts, right? But the more likely chance is that there's some form of government attack, government scaled attack, not that it's going to be long-term successful because Bitcoin overall is more resilient than the World Wide Web itself, but it's going to temporarily minimize its usefulness, right? So if you cannot liquidate it all of a sudden because the government makes it really, really hard, and simultaneously the price drops, that's a problem if half of your wealth is tied into that. If you have to make your mortgage payment in fiat and make your tax payments in fiat, right? So, but yet again, I mean, stores of values are always baskets. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, how much in that basket should be denominated in fiat, as little as possible, and there's no technical reason to have any at this point in time. And then how much should be denominated in other commodities and or assets and or rights.
Yeah. Chris, this has been fascinating, and I'm so grateful that that we had an opportunity to have this chat, and I'm really excited about as we build this thing out over the next coming weeks, months, and years, to have different people join us and to just become part of this dialogue. So I'd like to thank you. Any parting thoughts before we drop off?
Yeah, so anybody who's listening who hasn't bought any cryptocurrencies yet, and they're specifically Bitcoin, do that today, right? Get your hands wet, so to speak, and even if it's just buying it from a custodial exchange for the time being, but understand what's involved, and then once you have some skin in the game, you actually learn more, because that's the one thing that we have seen. Think about it. Did we ever have this amount of discussions around what is money and what is value and so forth? We never had those, right? Because we never had these opportunities to experiments around do experiments around these technologies. That's why it's so unfortunate to see so many misguided regulators talk about trying to regulate people within their jurisdictions to be able to engage with that. We should have done all of these experiments before we implemented the current monetary systems, which has been actually very nascent, right? So the currency we're using here in the United States has only been around since 1971, this particular experiment. And there's no indication that it's going to lead to any positive outcome. Anybody who's intellectually honest will say, okay, this experiment has failed and we are just delaying the inevitable, because there will never be less of it. There will always be significantly more of it. And if you give people the opportunity to create more of it without recourse, and people that are forced to use it have to suffer the consequences, that seems to actually be the opposite of what this good should be about. It's a very, very important tool to regulate the economy, and we should really think hard about how we let people create it right now. And again, it's more to the extent that we need to minimize the opportunities of commercial banks to create it for unproductive means, right? So a lot of the inflation that we have seen right now in the stock markets, aside from the housing markets, has been the availability of cheap credit, which then companies have been using, public companies, to compete with their shareholders and buy their stock backs. That's why the stock market is so tremendously inflated. So we inflated all these asset classes, and that's tremendously dangerous because they're all interconnected and people think that they're saving and investing. It will correct. There is no doubt that it will have to correct, because the actual pricing doesn't correlate to any real world economic activity and correlated value, right? And hasn't for quite some time, but we keep kicking down the can down the road. And I don't think that there's anybody actually disputing it outside of the federal bankers who think by interfering with actual market activity, they're doing anything that's beneficiary to the population at large. It's not. You don't ever want to interfere with private markets. That has always led to disaster across history. We have examples over examples over examples. Any centralized planning will fail. That has always failed, will always fail. right? Because you don't consider the interest of all stakeholders. You don't consider the interest of everybody who has to use that particular commodity. And now that people at large don't have to, sure, the powers that be are very concerned that the only tool that they have is going to be taken away from them. But it's better to face reality and say, yes, this experiment has failed. People have other alternatives, and let's implement these alternatives for the population at large as soon as possible, because other nations are doing it,
Yeah.
and will be doing it. And as I mentioned, technology can't be uninvented. The best thing you can do is embrace it.
Yeah. Boy, that's awesome. Look, I learned so much in talking to you today, and you've really opened my mind to all kinds of new thoughts, like the use case of money is spending and lending, and there's just so many things about this. So I want to thank you, Chris, for being on the thing, and I look forward to many more very engaging conversations in the future.
Sounds good. Talk to you soon.
Have a great day. Bye.